Hey everybody, and welcome back to another lecture with Coding with Roby. In this lecture, we're going to be going over path parameters within APIs. So let's dive into the code and let's learn about path parameters. So a path parameter is a way that you can add additional variables to an API call. It typically happens when you're using a GET call or some kind of post or something where you need to attach additional information to the URL that's not encrypted or secret from the client or user. For example, we're going to create a new API that at the end of the URL, we're going to say /books and then / the book title, and then return that book based on the ID that's passed in. But to start, let's do some examples of path parameters. Press enter a few times and make my IDE screen a little bit bigger. And right here, we're going to say @app.get, and then in the parentheses, we're going to do double quotes, and instead of an empty string like the read all books function, we're going to say /books/ and then in brackets, book title. And now we need to create a function for this. I'm going to create the function being called readBook as an asynchronous function, just like read all books is, but I'm going to pass in a parameter, and this parameter is going to be matching the book title that we have up here as a parameter also called book title. When we do that, FastAPI will automatically grab the path parameter within our API and turn it into a variable that we can use within the function. And now, since we have this parameter coming in that's getting passed in from the API.get path parameter, we can now use it within the function. So I'm just going to return a dictionary of book title with the book title that's passed in as the path parameter as a response. I'm going to save this file, and then I'm going to open up the terminal, and I'm going to start up my FastAPI server by saying unicorn books :app -- reload. And then once we get a successful application startup complete, I'm going to switch over into my browser, refresh the page, and we can see that we get the original /get that returns all the books. Let's jump into our docs. And here we can see that we get two separate APIs now. We have the read all books that we created in the last lecture where we can return all of the books. And then we also now have a new get API, which is /books/book title. If we open this up, we can see that, hey, within the path of this API, there's a requirement for a book title to be passed in. If we click try it out, we now have the ability to edit this description title box, which is going to pass in the path parameter for the function. If I type in computer science book and click execute, we can see that we get this curl command. So what the API actually looks like is HTTP, our URL and port, /books, and then /computer science book. If we look at the response body, we can see that we get book title with computer science book as the response. And again, this is books /computer science book because in the actual code, we are now saying it needs a /books and then book title. And then based on this book title, we turn it into a variable and then we return that book title as a dictionary. Now let's make this a book ID. I'm going to resave the file and I'm going to open up our browser again. And if I refresh the page, we can now see that we're passing in a book ID. If I say try it out again, we can pass in a number like 3. Execute, and we can see that it's /books/3, and we return book title and 3. Now, the first thing we can notice is that this 3, and we're talking about a book ID, so book ID probably needs to be an integer. And even though we want it to be an integer, we're returning a string. And this could be definitely mixing up between development and what a user is expecting, because they're passing in a book ID, which they're probably thinking is an integer or a numeric value of some kind. So if we go back in the code, we can dictate how to parse this book ID within the API based on just doing a type definition of the book ID within the parameter of the function. So we can say :int. And now, just like that, if we resave the application, FastAPI will automatically parse this book ID for us from a string into an integer. So if we go back to our browser and I refresh the screen, we can now see that book ID is required, but it must be an integer. So if we say try it out and type in 5 and click execute, we can see that we pass in 5 just like we did with 3, but FastAPI automatically parsed that last path parameter and turned it into an integer for us. And we can tell that because there's no longer quotation marks. Now, what happens if we don't pass in a number and we type in foo? We can see that Swagger documentation automatically says we are not allowed to do that. If we scroll down, we can see that the validation error example is saying, hey, this needs to not be a string, it needs to be an integer, because we are dynamically having FastAPI parse the last path parameter into an integer. And now order does matter within this application. So for example, let's say we have this book ID, but let's say we also created another function right above this called @app.get and then parentheses, and we're going to be reusing a lot of the functionality that we used in the read books. So within get, we're going to say /books/mybook, because we're going to pretend that this API now has the ability to know what our favorite book is when the API is called. And we're going to call this function async def and then read favorite book. And we're going to pass in no parameters or path parameters into this function. And now we're just going to return our favorite book. Now, order does matter, because if we go back into our Swagger documentation and we refresh the page, we can now see that I have read favorite book, where we can call and execute and receive my favorite book. However, in the code, we need to make sure that my favorite book or my book API is in front of book/book ID. Because if it's not, it's going to think that my book, which is the path, is actually a path parameter for book ID, which will cause this API to fail. So if you're going to be using path parameters, the path parameters must be underneath any kind of API that's going to be following the same kind of path. Now this wraps up everything that we need to talk about in this lecture, and I will see you in the next video.